For years, the conflict between Israel and Iran never quite looked like what most people imagine when they think of war. There were no tanks rolling across shared borders, no formal declarations read out at the United Nations, and no clear moment anyone could point to and say, "This is where it started." Instead, it lived in the spaces between official statements, in facilities that quietly stopped working, in scientists who disappeared without explanation, in computer systems that behaved strangely for reasons nobody could publicly confirm. By 2024, people working inside intelligence agencies across multiple continents had grown privately alarmed, not because something new had begun, but because something old had accelerated far beyond what the public understood. The Middle East was not approaching a new kind of war. It was already inside one. What made this conflict so difficult to grasp was precisely how little of it was visible. Keyboards were triggering consequences that once required armies. Hacked industrial systems were causing physical damage to real infrastructure. And somewhere behind the carefully worded denials and the long silences from government press offices, covert operations were allegedly pushing nuclear-capable powers closer to direct confrontation than at any point in recent memory. Most people had no idea how far things had already gone. To understand how the region arrived at this point, you have to go back further than 2024. Iran and Israel had regarded each other as existential threats for decades. The accusations ran in both directions and had for years. Iran pointed to sabotage operations and targeted killings it attributed to Israeli intelligence. Israel pointed to Iranian funding of armed groups across Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Yemen, and to a nuclear program it believed was never purely civilian in intent. But the nature of how they fought each other had quietly transformed over time. There was no official battlefield, no war ever formally declared, only a long accumulation of incidents that each side publicly attributed to accidents, technical malfunctions, or unnamed third parties. The strategy of ambiguity was not accidental. It was deliberate, because the moment either side officially claimed responsibility for an attack, the other side had justification to respond, and response carried the risk of escalation neither government wanted to navigate publicly, so instead they denied, and the conflict continued anyway. The moment that changed how the world thought about this kind of warfare came around 2010, when a piece of malicious software called Stuxnet was discovered inside Iranian nuclear facilities. What it did was genuinely unprecedented. It infiltrated the control systems managing uranium enrichment, centrifuges, and caused them to destroy themselves while simultaneously feeding false data to operators so that everything appeared to be functioning normally. Machines were tearing themselves apart, and the people responsible for monitoring them had no idea. Security researchers who eventually analyzed the code described it as unlike anything they had seen before. The level of technical knowledge required, the specificity of its targeting, the layers of deception embedded in its design, all of it pointed to a state-level operation with access to classified intelligence about the inner workings of Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Nobody officially claimed it, but the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. Physical infrastructure could now be attacked remotely, invisibly, and with a degree of deniability that conventional military operations could never offer. And if it had been done once, it could be done again. By 2024, the warnings had grown noticeably more urgent. The operations being described were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of sustained, coordinated campaigns targeting infrastructure that millions of people depended on every day: oil facilities, airport systems, water networks, power grids, financial platforms. Researchers noted that attacks were becoming more technically ambitious. The implicit restraint that had governed earlier operations seemed to be eroding. Communication infrastructure failed in ways engineers struggled to account for. Industrial networks went offline unexpectedly. Databases were accessed by parties who should not have had entry. Officials issued statements attributing these events to technical problems. But privately, a different explanation circulated among people whose job it was to understand such things. Reports emerged that Israeli-linked cyber units had allegedly targeted Iranian digital infrastructure, connected to military logistics and strategic communication systems. Iranian state media accused Israel of electronic sabotage designed to degrade command capability during a period of heightened regional tension. Israel did not respond publicly. That silence, former intelligence officials later explained, was itself a calculated choice. Acknowledging an operation, even to deny it, opens a conversation nobody wants to have on the record. Silence preserves ambiguity, and ambiguity in this kind of conflict is a strategic asset. What was making officials in multiple governments genuinely nervous by 2024 was the growing entanglement between cyber operations and conventional military activity. Modern weapon systems depend on software, on network connectivity, on real-time data flowing between sensors and decision makers. Drone operations require digital infrastructure. Missile defense systems require coordinated network communication. Battlefield surveillance depends on satellite links that can be disrupted or spoofed. A sophisticated cyber operation timed correctly could degrade military capability at a critical moment. It could feed false information into a decision-making process at exactly the wrong time. It could create the conditions for a catastrophic mistake. In April 2024, the shadow conflict briefly became impossible to ignore. Direct confrontations between Iran and Israel produced visible military exchanges the whole world could follow in real time. Missiles were fired, drones were intercepted, emergency meetings were convened. But while cameras tracked the visible dimension of what was happening, researchers monitoring digital infrastructure were observing something else entirely: unusual spikes in network activity that correlated with periods of military tension in ways difficult to attribute to coincidence. That combination, cyber disruption, layered on top of conventional military action, represented a genuinely new kind of threat. Not because either element was new on its own, but because together they created compounding effects that neither side's contingency planning had fully accounted for. Running beneath all of this was a deeper problem that artificial intelligence was rapidly making worse. Phishing campaigns that once required significant human efforts could now be generated at scale, personalized using harvested public data, and deployed faster than analysts could track them. Deepfake audio and video were becoming tools for disinformation operations that could fabricate evidence of events that never occurred. Automated attack systems could probe network defenses continuously, learning from each failed attempt. The technology was moving faster than policy, faster than international agreement, and in some cases faster than the defenses being built to contain it. What is easy to forget, watching all of this from a distance, is that the infrastructure being targeted is not abstract. Power stations, hospital networks, air traffic control systems, banking platforms. These are the systems that allow ordinary life to function. When they fail, real people experience real consequences. Medical procedures get interrupted. Emergency services cannot communicate. People cannot access money. A coordinated attack timed to accompany military activity could produce cascading failures across systems that were never designed to withstand this kind of simultaneous pressure. By late 2025, people whose professional responsibility was to track these things were describing a situation significantly more dangerous than it had been even a year earlier. one infrastructure failure misread as an attack, one retaliatory action taken on incomplete intelligence, one moment where the feedback loop between cyber operations and military decision-making produces an outcome nobody intended. These are the scenarios that keep experienced people in intelligence genuinely worried. Not the visible confrontations, and those are frightening, but they are also legible. People understand what they are looking at. What is harder to manage is the confrontation nobody sees coming and that begins as a line of code on a server in an undisclosed location and produces consequences in the physical world before anyone has had time to understand what is happening. Much of what has occurred in this conflict will likely never be fully known. Governments do not declassify this material on convenient timelines. What reaches the public is a partial, delayed, and deliberately incomplete picture assembled from leaks and investigative reporting. The rest remains where it has always been, inside secure buildings, on classified networks, known to small numbers of people bound by obligations they take seriously, and somewhere right now, in facilities that do not appear on public maps, people are sitting in front of screens, watching data move across networks, looking for patterns that might indicate something has already begun, because that is the nature of this kind of conflict. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for permission. And by the time the evidence becomes clear enough to act on, the first move has usually already been made.